Hey everybody, Coach Toolshed here. In today's video, I want to discuss a topic that I haven't really discussed here on the channel before in any sort of depth. I want to really get deep into this topic today and look at something that gets talked about all the time in the world of gaming, especially when we get one of these delays for a big game or whenever the topic of employee overwork comes up. And we're talking, of course, about crunch because, again, I'm sure many of you have seen over the last day or so, we saw several news articles come out yesterday from all the corporate media websites and many videos here on YouTube coming up, getting all worked up about CD Projekt Red announcing that, yes, they're going to, in fact, have to have an extended crunch period when it comes to the manufacturing of Cyberpunk 2077. Of course, earlier this week, we got the announcement that the game was going to be getting delayed until September. I covered that in my last video. And of course, also Square Enix this week making big news by pushing back the release dates of Final Fantasy VII Remake and The Avengers. Now, right off the bat, let me just say a little bit disclaimer. I know that I have several smaller indie developers that do watch the channel. I've talked to many of you in the comments before. I actually, just a couple weeks ago, someone else came on and was talking to me about how they were making a game for Epic and whatnot. And so I know that I have some smaller indie developers watching the channel. This video does not apply to small indie developers that are actually struggling to get by, who's really relying on any proceeds from their next game to really ensure whether or not they're even going to have a company going forward into the next year, whether or not they can remain solvent. This is not a conversation about indie development, especially, the really small people that are trying and struggling to survive. This, I'm talking about AAA development, games and developers and publishers where they measure their revenue not in the thousands or the millions, but in the hundreds of millions to the billions. That's what I'm talking about today. And the first thing I want to discuss is something that goes through my head every single time this topic starts going through the news cycle. It's a question that I've never seen anyone discuss. I've never seen anyone ask a game developer this question. We always get these news stories, and I'm going to talk about specifics later on, but we get these stories and we get these videos being made, and it makes it sound like these developers are literally like this indentured servitude or almost forced slave labor that they're having to endure to make these games. And that's what I want to discuss today. And they make it sound like everything's just so awful. They hate their job. They hate the co-workers that they have to deal with. They hate their bosses. We know that they hate the audience a lot of the time. They're talking about how they're all stressed out. They're suffering from PTSD somehow and all this that we hear. And they just make it sound like it's so awful. And the excuse we hear all the time when you say, well, why do you do it? They say that it's always the excuse that they put up with it because they don't want to get blacklisted in the industry. They don't want to make it seem to other companies that they're unwilling to work. They don't want to, let the team down and make it seem like they're a bad employee because they don't want to lose their spot in the gaming industry because it's so competitive to get in. We're going to discuss that too in a little bit. But they talk about how competitive it is to get into game development and that they don't want to lose their spot in the industry. And the question that I always ask, that I've never seen anyone talk about, if the industry is so awful, if it's such a grind, if it's just this meat grinder that just chews you up and spits you out, and it's just so horrendous and terrible, then why are you in such a hurry to keep your spot in that industry? Why are you worried about being blacklisted? If you hate the industry so much, why would you care to keep your spot and maintain your place in the gaming industry? That just makes no cognitive sense in any way, shape, or form. And I want to discuss some of the stuff involved when it comes to being a software developer and this notion that these people are somehow trapped by these companies into working for them because it's sheer and utter complete nonsense. It's just complete nonsense. Software development, if you go online and check some of this stuff out, which I've done for this video, if you look at the list of the top 10 most sought after types of employees in Western society, especially here in America, software development and software engineering are the top most sought after workers in all of society. The rest of the list is generally filled out with the medical profession, which, by the way, we want to talk about stress. The medical profession has far more overwork and stress than any game developer ever has to deal with. Talk about doctors who are doing their rounds when they're interns. Go talk to them and talk about stress and overwork in the medical profession, which, by the way, I'm sorry to say, is a hell of a lot more important than game development. I hate to break it to everyone, and yet though they're also very sought after, yet that's a stressful position. You also have construction workers on the list because, once again, that's a very dangerous job. It's a lot of manual labor. It's a lot of tough work. We're going to get into that a little bit later on, compare that to game development. But I just want to point out that it is not going to be difficult for someone who works in game development to transition to another type of software development. They're not tied down to game development. Whether you're a graphic designer or a composer or you do sound design or you're just a coder, it doesn't matter, or whether you're a tester. There's so much other stuff you can go into. There's so many different types of applications aside from game development. There's so much more to the world of software design. The jobs will translate. You're not tied down to working in the games industry. This is not indentured servitude. You're not tied to the industry. Like, can we just get this notion out of our heads? Like, it's sheer, like I said, it's sheer nonsense. The other thing, conversely, if you look on these job recruitment sites and these job ranking sites, the software development is also one of the most sought after positions for workers to go into. They want to go into the industry. You want to know why? Because the baseline salary, the average salary for starting entry-level positions, is amongst the highest, again, in all of society. This notion that if you're a game developer, I mean, you can just go and look at the numbers. Go and look at the jobs listings. The jobs listings for game developers, you can go onto all these recruitment sites and check them out yourself. Many of them, 80,000, 90,000, 100,000 a year. And again, these job listings are right there for anyone to see. So this notion that, like, if you're working for one of these big companies, that you're struggling, you're starving to death, and you're not going to be able to feed yourself, which is one of the rebuttals you see from fans all the time. Oh, how do you want these people to starve to death? Yeah, they're not. If you're working on a major AAA game, you're not starving to death. Okay, you are one of the highest paid people in society, especially for what you do for work. And the funny thing about it, the argument will then turn to, well, see, a lot of these companies, the people are being paid salary, so they're working way more hours than a 40-hour work week. Well, we're going to get into that just for a second, because I want to talk about this notion that's going around now about crunch itself. Because for years, and actually in researching this video, I found some articles going back all the way to 2011 on, like, Ars Technica talking about crunch. So it's been literally a decade where the games media has been trying to make us feel guilty and like it's our fault somehow for crunch. Because, for years it was, these developers, they have to crunch because we're so impatient. It's the gamers' fault. We're demanding these games come out right away, so it's our fault. And if it wasn't for our impatient demands, our immature demands and entitlement upon the game developers, that they wouldn't have to deal with this crunch. And as you've seen over the last decade, the amount of people who get upset about a delay is almost non-existent now compared to the amount of people, which I discussed in my last video, the amount of people that will just be like, oh, I'm happy there's a delay. The game will be better now. The game, the developers won't have to work as hard. We'll have more time. The game will be more polished and all that. That's the prevailing attitude now. Go look at any comment when people are delaying a game. Go look at any comment section and see what people are saying. The overwhelming majority of people are saying something similar to that. They're very encouraged. They're very happy. Oh, we like the delay. This gives me more time to do this. And now they can polish the game and all this nonsense. Now, what they're doing now is, the article's coming out now. This was hilarious. I saw this yesterday. I'm like, oh, this is the new tactic they're going to pull. Because you see, over the last decade, gamers got more patient. But they can't recognize that and acknowledge that gamers have gotten more patient. No, they have to blame us again. This is what they're doing now. I saw an article from gaming's most influential journalist yesterday, and of course, I know you know who I'm talking about, but he was suggesting that, once again, it's somehow our fault, because you see now, when we get a game's delay, now it's just leading to further crunch, and now the crunch period, which was already in effect leading up to the release date for these games, now that they're extending the deadline out, that is going to lead to more crunch. And again, it's somehow our fault for being too impatient, and that we're demanding that they have to get the game out right away, which of course almost no one is doing. And this completely ignores the fact, when we talk about a delay like with Cyberpunk 2077 that we're seeing, and it's getting pushed back a few more months, we see this notion that, like, it's our fault that a game company has to crunch to make the game more polished, that we're somehow too demanding, and that, we as gamers, we won't accept an unpolished product. Well, here's the fact, and I've made entire videos about this before. We shouldn't be accepting unfinished products or unpolished products. It doesn't fly in any other industry. It shouldn't fly with games industry either. But the fact is, now we have people making arguments that, well, if they need to take an extra year, maybe even 2 of game development in order to avoid crunch, that's perfectly acceptable and that's what they should be doing. And I know that crunch sucks and working overtime sucks, but the fact is, when you just say that they can just extend the timeline by a year or 2 years just on a whim, do any of you people understand how budgets work? Do you understand the sheer amount of money that goes out the door in employee salary on a yearly basis, especially when we're talking about these major AAA publishers? One of the common misconceptions about CD Projekt Red, for example, is that they're a small company. At one point they were. But did you know that right now they have several hundred employees working at CD Projekt Red specifically, and CD Projekt on the whole has over 800 employees? And CD Projekt Red has over 500 employees right now? Were you aware of that? And even though I know in Poland the exchange rate and the currency is a little bit different, so they don't get paid quite as much. But let's translate that to an American company or a Canadian company or something like that, where people are making more money and the studio sizes are relatively the same. We know Ubisoft has many studios working on games with hundreds of employees, for example. EA has hundreds of people working on any given game, and that's how it goes. If you extend a game out for an extra year or 2, and that's not budgeted in ahead of time, we're talking about tens of millions, maybe 100 millions of extra dollars just in salary. And if that's not in part of the budget, it's not possible to do. Now, of course, if you're an uber wealthy company like EA, you could eat that profit. But a company like CD Projekt Red, while they are a big time name in the company, they can't necessarily afford to go 2 more years into the development cycle. That will seriously affect their money. Let's not forget, this is a game that got announced in 2013, 7 years ago. So now you're talking about, let's give them till 2022 to finish the game, so there's no crunch. Well, at some point, you have to call it. You have to be like a doctor at the morgue. You got to call it at some point. DOA. You can't just have infinite development time. It's not possible. You want the studios to shut down? Again, this won't apply to the biggest of companies, but even the smaller developers, this will affect them. It absolutely would. And denying that is just sheer stupidity as far as I'm concerned. The other thing is, we the public, and I talked about this in my last video, we the public, we don't set the release dates. So when you talk about people, they're demanding that this game come out now. No, CD Projekt Red came out and said the game will be ready when it's ready. And then they set a release date, and then they pushed it back. And if people, you can't try to hold that to the player's head and be like, you entitled, overly demanding fans, how dare you? Now they have to do extra crunch. We have absolutely no control over this timeline whatsoever. So kindly, just shut up with this nonsense. I am so sick to death of the gaming journalist media from these corporate websites trying to blame literally everything on gamers. And now, like I said, they've completely changed the conversation. First, we were too impatient and we had to expect delays. And then when we accepted that delays were inevitable for many games, now it's still our fault because now crunch. It's crunch. We're so demanding again. Just shut your mouth with this nonsense. Anyway, let's move on to the next topic. And the next topic, now this one's going to be just as easy to predict as the sun coming up tomorrow. What's going to happen next is on Monday or Tuesday of next week, we are inevitably going to get another round of articles and another round of videos talking about, once again, unions, because that is how this conversation always takes place. Right now, over the weekend, I guarantee you, everyone's furiously typing out their articles so they can publish them first thing Monday morning, talking about how because of the recent developments that we've seen with these delays and CD Projekt Red daring to announce that they have to have crunch for their game. Well, now we have to bring up the topic of unions once again. And I want to discuss this because I feel like so many people who talk about this have no concept about how unions work in any way, shape, or form. The conversation always seems to be that somehow unionization is this magic bullet that will cure every single problem with game development. Workers will be protected, they'll no longer have to be overworked, everything will be glorious, and game development will be totally changed and perfect once unions get involved. This is so unbelievably stupid and just shows a complete lack of ignorance about how unions actually work. Can unions be good in some ways? Absolutely. Can they also screw over workers in some ways? Yes, and we're going to discuss some of this. Now, the main benefit in reality, and this is a huge and great, absolute fantastic benefit that unions do provide for the most part, and that is, generally speaking, they will set the employees up for retirement with pensions or 401ks or both, something, all of this stuff. They will set up employees so that they're not screwed over when it comes to retirement age. They'll get paid a certain wage. Most unions require you to pay dues, and that's one of the nonsense things you got to deal with, but you are very much protected as you head into retirement age. That is, for me, when I look at the situation with most unions, that is the number one and most important thing that you can gain from a union. Also, generally speaking, you will have higher pay for your workers in that situation. However, there's a lot more that goes into that. Now, the first thing, and this is the most important thing, is just being in a union guarantees you nothing. You have to have a union with coherent leadership that is a strong union if you want to make waves. You have to keep in mind, when you're going to be dealing with AAA companies, you're dealing with some of the dirtiest, most backstabbing companies in existence on the planet. So you can't have it just be like, we're in a union now, and think that that's going to solve everything. You have to have strong union leadership. You got to have lawyers involved. Let's take a look at American sports so I can give you an example of what I'm talking about. The Major League Baseball, the MLB, and the NFL Players Union, National Football League, they both have their own unions. And the massive difference is that this has gone on for decades and decades. Baseball players have an extremely powerful and strong union with strong leadership that has negotiated them with guaranteed contracts. They get paid a fortune. Their arbitration rights are generally in favor of players getting paid a lot of money after a few years in the league. They do have certain rules where they're going to be contractually obligated to certain teams based on where they were drafted and stuff like that. But in general, baseball players have so much more protection with their contracts than the NFL players. The NFL union is generally, over the decades, has been extremely weak, and those players get screwed over. They don't get taken care of when they retire. Now, they're starting to change some of that going forward because of the CTE scandals and all that stuff, the brain injuries that have been going on. So more work has been getting done as far as unions go there, but NFL players don't have guaranteed contracts. They can get cut at any time and just they can lose all of their money that isn't written into guaranteed forms on the contract. Their union is extremely weak. So again, if you're just thinking that being in a gaming union is this magic bullet that's going to solve all your problems, no, you actually have to have a cohesive union that actually does the work it's supposed to do. The other thing is, lots of people think that being in a union that's going to magically protect you from getting laid off. I have no concept why anyone would think that, and that just goes to show that people have no idea what happens in unions. You can absolutely be laid off when you're working in a union. If your company doesn't have work for you to do, guess what? You don't get paid if you're not working. That's just how it goes. You're going to get laid off. I have no concept of where people got this idea that you're going to be protected from layoffs, even mass layoffs, if you're in a union. That is simply not true at all. They also seem to think that if you're in a union, you're magically going to be protected from working overtime or long hours. Again, not true. I know some tradesmen who a couple years ago had to do an emergency project. It was actually a very critical project. And they are part of a union, and they were both for months on end working every single day of the week from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. 12-hour days every single day for months because of a crunch project. And that was in a well-established union, and actually a powerful union, yet because of a certain project that had to get done as fast as possible, they had to rush the project, and they had to work those hours. So again, when people seem... I really... It shows the ignorance level of people who talk about unions. I don't think many of these people even know anyone that works in a union. They just seem to think that union has to be good all the time. Let's talk about some other stuff. Lots of people talk about if you're not getting the rights you want, or if you're not getting the salary you want, or the hours you want, well, you can just go on strike. Everyone talks about the workers going on strike. For example, the state that I work in, there's a huge part of the state that is controlled by one gas company. And a couple years ago, all the construction projects in the city were shut down because this gas company, everyone thought that the workers were on strike. That wasn't the case, but everyone was saying, oh, the workers are on strike, the workers are on strike, we can't finish these jobs. All these projects are put on hold because we can't get the gas company to hook up the stuff, and they're the only company that is authorized to do it. And the workers are on strike. Not true. They weren't on strike. They were locked out by the ownership group, which is the other issue that no one ever talks about when it comes to unions. If you make demands that the companies are not willing to accept, they will just lock you out and hire scabs. That's what... It's amazing. There's so many examples of this over the years that you can go back and see. Even major stuff. We talked about baseball earlier, MLB. They did the same thing. The players' union, at one point, the owners locked out all the players and started hiring replacement players, and they took the field. And baseball lost a half a season at one point. They just shut the whole league down. It actually happens, the threat of it happens every time there's a CBA. Every time the collective bargaining agreement comes into focus, people threaten a lockout or a strike. But no one ever really wants to talk about the lockouts. They just want to talk about the workers' rights. It's just, you have to look at both sides of the coin. And again, this gets ignored entirely when it comes to the conversation coming from these gaming websites and these pundits here on YouTube. They don't even think about this stuff. And it just shows that they don't know what they're talking about. Can unions be good? Yes. Can they also be bad? Yes. Let's look at another aspect. Let's look at how it affects the overall market. This is something else that I don't think ever gets even thought of when it comes to the union conversation. The only companies that can successfully handle union demands, it's not going to be the small-time indie developers. It's going to be the really large companies with the deep pockets that will be able to handle collectively bargaining with a huge group of people. If you want to start a gamers developer union where everyone who's a game developer in the country is part of this union, then how are indie developers supposed to survive? They won't be able to, because the people who work at the big companies won't accept the lower wages that an indie developer company will have to pay in order to survive. So not only will that lead to existing companies having to close up shop and more developers having to search for jobs at the big, Activision and EA and Ubisoft, those type of jobs, but you're also going to discourage other indie developers from going out and trying games on their own because they won't be able to even open up shop. You will basically put an end to new indie studios opening up if every worker has to be part of this union, because they simply won't be able to afford the overhead. And that's just a fact of life. So I know a lot of people who argue in favor of unions, they would consider themselves to be on a certain side of the political spectrum, the anti-corporation side of the spectrum, yet they don't seem to think that when you're pushing for unionization, you're really effectively helping out only the larger corporations, because they're going to be losing the competition from the indie development scene. And it's going to be more and more consolidated into only AAA gaming space and less on the side where the most creativity happens and where a lot of us want to put our money, which is into the indie development, is going to further suffocate that market. And that's a market reality that people don't want to think about. But anyway, let's move on from unions. That's just some of the thoughts that every time this conversation comes up, these are some of the things that go through my head, and I know for a fact that people don't understand what the hell they're talking about. The other thing I want to talk about is the absolute hyperbolic nonsense rhetoric that we get spoon-fed from all of these websites and people here on YouTube talking about working conditions at these companies as if these people are working in a Vietnamese sweatshop run by Frank Reynolds. That's simply not the case. Go ahead and do a Google search and look at some of the office spaces for EA employees and for Ubisoft employees and Activision employees and all these big companies. Go and look at the office spaces where these people work. Maybe you've seen some documentaries where they go behind the scenes. Those aren't exactly, disastrous working conditions. They're in physical spaces. The workspaces that they're provided are literally the most lavish office spaces you can find on the planet. They're absolutely huge, spacious, air conditioned. Everything's bright. They got their game rooms. They got food. It's some of these places are like small campuses that they're working on, just dedicated to the game developers. And yet we're made to believe that they're working in some sweatshop, cramped into a cubicle, working on 1984 Macintosh computers, barely able to do anything. It's absurd. They have the most high-end technology available in the world at their disposal, all the space they could ever need, all the amenities they can possibly need, and yet we're being asked to feel guilty somehow for wanting a game from this company. And yet this completely ignores the fact that software development and game development especially, these are some of the most sought after careers for a reason. It's because they have actually good working environments, much better than what most people have to deal with. And the common rebuttal is, well, yeah, some people have to deal with worse working conditions, but everyone should have better working conditions. So just because that some people have it worse, that doesn't mean game developers can't have it better. And yeah, you can make that argument, but the fact is, game developers have it far better off than so many more employees. It's not even funny when it comes to the workforce. I don't understand how anyone can make these comparisons with a straight face and act like the people that they're deriding, the people who are actually paying, are the problem. You see stuff, you read some of these articles. There was big articles came out last year talking about like Activision layoffs and stuff like that. And we literally saw people complaining that they weren't invited to a Christmas party. Or that, they had to come in and work mandatory Saturdays for a couple of months. This is is this really what we're talking about? You didn't get promoted. People weren't listening to you in a meeting. This is really what we're talking about? I've had jobs. I've literally had jobs. I had a guy have a heart attack standing next to me at work. He collapsed, fell on the floor because he was so stressed out and overworked in an environment that was also far too physically demanding for him. And he collapsed. They dragged him off. The ambulance came and took him out, and he was out of work for only a week. Yet during that week, I heard my boss complaining that, Dan's really screwing us over, missing all this time. And I looked at her. I said, are you serious right now? How can you sit there and act like he's screwing you over? He had a heart attack on your job, and you're acting like he somehow has done some great offense to you. This is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you're someone who works in a real stressful environment. What if you're someone who, I mentioned earlier, the medical profession, where they have to work insane hours on end in a far more stressful, far more important environment? What about firefighters when there's an emergency situation and they have to go? What about the California wildfires and you got the firefighters out there working round the clock trying to put out these fires? What about restaurant workers who routinely, every day, they don't have crunch periods. Their entire life is crunch if you work in a restaurant. You're working double shifts every weekend. You're working 6-7 days a week. You're working in environments that are over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. You literally don't get breaks if you work in a restaurant. Did you know that? This notion that we need to feel sorry for game developers of the situation they're in is absolutely absurd. I've worked for a company. I worked for a company one time. We had mass layoffs. They laid off hundreds of people. They closed down several locations. So when I read articles about Activision, I see how they handle their layoff, and everyone loses their mind about the Activision layoffs. And yet they don't read a little further down in these articles where they say that the people are getting hefty severance packages and they're being helped with work assistance to find new job placement after the fact, and they're able to go in and talk to advisors and get help with all the other stuff that they need, transition into health insurance and stuff like that. That's what happens at these big companies with these layoffs, and everyone loses their mind. Now, does getting laid off suck? Yeah, it does suck. Let me explain to you what happens to regular workers when we get laid off. I got laid off from a company. They came in on Valentine's Day afternoon and had all of the managers in the entire company in on a conference call. And my manager came out of her office sobbing and informed everyone that we no longer had jobs. And not only did we no longer have a job, they didn't pay us. We did not get a dime for that week's pay. Not only that, they went into our direct deposit money from the week prior, money which most of us had already spent, and removed the previous week's paycheck as well. Because you see, they didn't have enough money in the coffers to pay us. Now, eventually, years later, through a class action settlement, we did get our money. But at the time, I was not only was I bankrupt, I was in debt now to the bank. And the bank called me and told me they were going to charge me $25 a day just until I got my payment back up to $0 in my bank account. Because you see, now I was several $100s in debt to my bank. My account was in arrears. So instantly, through no fault of my own, I'm left penniless, bankrupt, and in debt just for showing up to work. So I'm so sorry that when I see that Activision employees get laid off and they're being treated with these full severance packages and everything else, I'm sorry if I don't feel so bad for them. Now again, does getting laid off suck? Yes, it absolutely does. But you can also go and find another job because, again, like I said at the start of the video, software development is literally the most sought after position and the most sought after worker type in society. I could keep going. I could tell you about all sorts of stories. Actually, here's another story. And I know that this is all anecdotal, but I'm just giving you some experiences. At one point, I was working outside. It was in the middle of summer. It was one of the hottest days of the year. And everyone on the crew, we'd been working out in the heat all day long for several days. And our boss was not letting us take breaks, except very early in the morning. Then we were working about 6-7 hours straight through the afternoon. And by the end of the week on Friday, we were pretty much spent. And I went to my boss and said, look, I'm ready to eat the last couple hours. You don't even got to pay me. Just let me go home. I'm done. And the guy looked at me and he said, no one's leaving until someone collapses. That's a quote from my boss. And guess what happened? Coincidentally enough, a couple hours later, I stopped sweating. I started shaking. I collapsed and started dry heaving and vomiting up bile. Because you see, I had a heat stroke at work. Now, I got rushed to the hospital. I was in the hospital overnight, all weekend, hooked up to IVs because my boss looked me right in the eye and told me that I couldn't go home until I collapsed. And I literally did collapse at work. And this was when I was in my prime. I was in fine shape. This was not like an underlying medical condition. This is just me being, you want to talk about being overworked? I'm so sorry. I don't want to hear it. I'm sick to death of these articles being made out to guilt trip the gamers, to being told that we're entitled, to act like we are the problem when we react to game companies jerking us around with release states, and that we're overly demanding, and that crunch is now our fault. That's literally what they're starting to say now. Crunch is our fault, and also delays are now our fault, and us appreciating delays. Well, we also have to be made to feel bad for that. It's absolute and sheer utter nonsense. Now again, I want to point out, I'm always on the side of workers having an easier time at work and not getting screwed over by the boss. I want to make that clear. I absolutely have no respect for people that mistreat their employees, and I have had many fights with many of my bosses, and I will just leave. I have left many jobs, and I'll look the boss and the owner right in the eye and I'll tell them exactly why I'm leaving, because I won't put up with it anymore. I put up with it for a lot of years. I've entirely switched my career from what I was doing earlier in my life. I do something entirely different now. I left the entire industry. And again, let me circle back to what I said at the very start of the video. If these working conditions are really so bad, if crunch is really so awful, and these jobs are so unbearable to work for, they're so stressful, unbearable working conditions, then why is everyone in such a hurry to keep their job in the industry? There's no cognitive sense there whatsoever. That's why I don't buy it. And I don't buy into these media hype pieces. And no, I'm not going to link any articles down below. If you want to find them, go find them yourself. I'm not going to link all their articles to you and get them more clicks. I'm not going to bother giving you archived versions. I mean, if you're really dying to read their articles, go do it. But just, I'm sure several of you have seen it, and I know that there's been my inbox on YouTube has been inundated with recommendations for videos talking about crunch. And I'm just sick to death of it. I'm not taking the blame for the work environments that I have no control over. And I'm sick to death of the ignorant audaciousness of these arguments trying to blame gamers for every single problem in the industry. Enough's enough. Cut with the nonsense. Everyone sees through your crap. And you want to know what? To the people on YouTube that go along with this crap because they don't want to make waves in the industry, they don't want to get called out on Twitter, a reset era, enough with all that BS too. You guys know what reality is here. Stop with the nonsense. Stop with the hyperbole. We're sick to death of it. Enough. Anyway, I know there's going to be people that disagree with me, but let me know what you guys think. I'm Coach Toolshed. Please subscribe if you want to stay in tune with the channel head forward, and as always, keep it turned to 11.